Welcome to my very first podcast series. It's called On the Path. In my first episode, everyone has a story. This is mine. I'm Dr. Jack Gatti Hilton, aka Unsung Empath, and I want to start by saying this isn't a podcast you need to rush through. This is a space to slow down, to think, to listen, and to sit with ideas and stories that usually get skimmed over or wrapped up too quickly. On the Path is about healing, faith, mental health, and the human stories underneath all of it. The stories that don't fit neatly into advice, theology, or diagnoses, but still shape how we live, relate, and survive. So if you're listening while driving, walking, cleaning, sitting quietly, or tending to the kids or the animals at home, you're exactly where you need to be. So why now? Why am I starting a podcast now in my life, in my career? Well, this is actually something I wanted to do for many years. I wanted to do something that re- tied into my previous careers. So many of you may not actually know, but I used to be a television news reporter. I also used to do a few like radio hosting as well. But it's not because I feel like I have all the answers, but it's because I spent my entire life noticing something. People carry far more than they let on, and most of them have never had space to tell their whole story. Social media compresses stories, institutions sanitize them, even therapy sometimes unintentionally rushes them. So, this podcast is my attempt to create space again, not for spectacle, but for honesty. So, as I mentioned earlier, before mental health, before becoming a clinician, before teaching, I was a reporter. And even then, I wasn't drawn to breaking news. I wasn't chasing chaos or controversy. I was drawn to people. I love platforms like Humans of New York, not because it was flashy, but because it was simple. A photo, a few sentences, and suddenly someone you walked past without even noticing became fully human. I was also deeply influenced by Steve Hartman. I was actually really still am pretty close to his camera guy, Les Rose. I just was drawn to his belief that everyone has a story. That phrase stuck with me, not as a slogan, but as a posture. He didn't rush people. He didn't turn pain into content. He let stories unfold at their own pace. What I didn't realize at that time was that this wasn't just journalism training, it was formation. I was so drawn to the fact that he could throw a dart onto a map and boom, found somebody, called the phone book or whatever name he randomly chose, did an entire story, and that story had such a meaning and impact. I grew up learning how to read rooms early. I learned how to notice tone shifts, how to sense when something wasn't being said, how to stay emotionally present in complicated situations. Some of that came from my upbringing, some of it came from instability, sadly, and some of it came from family loss and tragedy. There were moments growing up where the world didn't make sense. I learned quietly how to adapt, how to listen, how to hold tension. I didn't have words for it back then, but I was learning empathy long before I knew it would become central to my work. A tragedy in my family reshaped how I understood suffering. It wasn't something that resolved neatly, it was something you could assign meaning to right away. It didn't come with lessons attached, and that mattered. It mattered a lot because I learned, as a kid, that the world was unsafe. But the loss of my uncle, he was a famous boxer, Arturo Gatti, who my family believed was murdered in Brazil, taught me that at any moment, tragedy can hit and change your entire life. It taught me that pain doesn't need explanation first, it needs presence. That experience stayed with me. It changed how I listened, it changed what I paid attention to, and eventually it changed the direction of my entire life. In a lot of ways, therapy became another form of storytelling. Sitting with people, listening carefully, helping them make sense of their inner world, not fixing, not performing, not rushing insight, just staying long enough for clarity to emerge. I always kind of look at when I worked at the inpatient hospital at a local psychiatric hospital here in the greater Bangor area. When I did every intake, I got to hear stories that nobody have ever even considered. I saw people who themselves didn't even recognize how much their own story shaped them into who they are. And sometimes it was stories, because of trauma that was caused by other people, situations like my uncle where tragedy hits. And for me, when I think about the work that we do as clinicians, even as journalists, I don't know, it had this impact to what I wanted to do. We as therapists don't just hold people's stories. In some ways, we help people reclaim their voices. And what I love about my journey in mental health, it was that realization that mental health wasn't a departure from journalism. It was a continuation of it. I've worked in inpatient settings, like I mentioned. I've worked with severe mental illness. I've worked with trauma, shame, faith, struggles, and people doing everything they can just to stay afloat. And one thing became very clear to me early on: most people aren't broken. They're protecting themselves, their beliefs, behaviors, and roles usually started as solutions. They just stopped working. That realization changed how I practice and how I see people. That realization wasn't just professional, it was personal. My healing didn't begin with blame, it began with honesty. I can finally see how my expectations, interpretations, roles, and beliefs were trying to protect me, and sometimes they were also keeping me hurting. These patterns weren't failures, they were survival. And naming that wasn't shame, it was clarity. And clarity opened the door to change. That philosophy led me to create Greater Love Counseling. It's my psychotherapy practice in the Greater Maine area. I wanted a space that felt safe, that felt grounded and human, especially for people of faith who had been told their struggles meant something was wrong with them spiritually. I don't believe healing comes from fixing people. I mentioned that earlier. I believe it comes from understanding them. Over time, that understanding gave language to something I call the P.A.T.H model: presence, alignment, truth, healing, not as a rigid system, but as a way of walking. Healing happens when we slow down enough to be present, honest enough to face the truth, and aligned enough to move in a truer direction, and patient enough to let healing unfold. And again, this is the beauty of the P.A.T.H model, is creation of a podcast series like this, On The P.A.T.H. And as you notice on the path, it's P-A.T.H, but with the dots in between, because P.A.T.H actually stands for the acronym Presence, Alignment, Truth, Healing, which is the model I created. Alongside clinical work, I teach as an adjunct professor. Teaching personally keeps me grounded. It mixes things up a little bit. Sometimes just back-to-back therapy sessions can become a lot for somebody like me. I'm always kind of with an entrepreneur brain. I love, and I've always loved educating. I loved engaging with students and fellow clinicians, teaching them different skill sets. At the hospital, I used to do a lot of training on recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, structural dissociation, conversations around EMDR. I'm not certified in EMDR. I'm fully trained. So I didn't really train people in EMDR, but just had conversations about the importance of EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. It's an acronym. But for me, teaching keeps me grounded. It keeps me honest. It reminds me that theory only matters if it helps real people in real situations. I care deeply about preparing future social workers to stay human in systems that often reward detachment. On the P.A.T.H is a space for honest conversations. We'll talk about mental health, faith, doubt, trauma, and resilience systems that help and systems that harm. I'll bring on clinicians, educators, pastors, community leaders, and people walking their own healing journeys. This isn't about answers. It's about staying present long enough to hear the truth. I believe the most powerful stories are the ones that don't shout. They're the ones that sit with you, the ones that make you feel seen, the ones that remind you you're not alone. If that's the kind of space you've been looking for, well, I'm glad you're here. And for me, I mentioned I'll bring on those guests. I also plan to bring on individuals like my brother, my sisters, all those individuals that have shaped my own journey into the person I am today. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time on The Path.